All right. Good morning, everybody. How are you? Great, great. I'm really happy to be here, and I think that this is such a great group, and wow, have I learned a lot this morning. Thank you. Looking forward to learning more this afternoon. So I am Jane Stevens. I am founder and editor of ACES Too High and ACES Connection. They are part of the ACES Connection network. ACES Too High is a niche news site that covers research about adverse childhood experiences, as well as people who are putting this research into practice. ACES Connection is the accompanying social media network. It's a community of practice social network, and there are about 4,000 people on there who are implementing or thinking about implementing practices based on ACES research. And both of these sites are supported by the California Endowment, which I'm very grateful for, as well as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm just going to go a little bit into the ACE study because Dr. Folletti isn't here, and Louise asked me to do a quick review of it, so I will do that. So before I get into it, just this one point, that ACE research is just one part of this unified science of human development that we are learning and that has emerged over the last 15 or 20 years, and it's a remarkable time we're in, just a remarkable time that with all this coming together. So the ACE study is one. It's the epidemiology of childhood adversity. Then there's the neurobiology of toxic stress, the long-term biomedical and epigenetic consequences of toxic stress, as well as the good news, which is the resilience research. And I'm going to try to keep a smile on my face as I go through the ACE study because what Bessel said earlier, because it's sometimes hard to take in because it does affect all of us. So the ACE study was done in the mid to late 90s. The first paper was published in 1998. It was a project that was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. It measured 10 types of childhood adversity. The usual suspects, which are, neglect and emotional neglect and verbal neglect, emotional neglect and physical neglect, as well as abuse, the physical, psychological, and sexual, and then 5 types of family dysfunction, as you can see here. Now, of course, there are many more types of trauma, and some of the more recent ACE surveys that have been done in other places have started adding other types of trauma. And I think that Marty Teicher has, what, like 2 dozen or so, maybe a little more?
Yes, a brand new paper just came out.
Oh, good.
New way of measuring.
I will look for it and put it on ACES Too High and ACES Connection. But they measured these 10 because these were the 10 that were most identified from a pilot group that they had looked at previously before they started the ACE study, as well as there was a lot of research about these individual types of trauma and the consequences. One of the most important things that came out of this was that trauma didn't happen alone. Sexual abuse doesn't happen alone, or physical abuse doesn't happen alone. More than likely, if there's one, there are others. And so you can see here the breakdown of this particular group that they studied, that most people had at least one. And I think it's like 42%, my math here, had 2 or more. When it gets to 3 or 4 or more is when you start actually seeing some of the severe consequences of this. It happens in a dose response, so that the more types of trauma that you've experienced as a child, your risk of things like chronic depression, other chronic diseases, autoimmune diseases, heart diseases, lung cancer, skin cancer, you name it, go up. Alcoholism goes up 12 times if you have an ACE score of 4. Alcoholism goes up 7 times if you have an ACE score of 4. With an ACE score of 4, your risk of attempting suicide goes up 12 times. Heart disease is about twice as much. Chronic obstructive lung disease is about 3 times with an ACE score of 4. This is really interesting because it gets into the behavior as well. And the risk of perpetrating violence goes up for men and for women. And some really interesting piece of research that is attributed to this is that if a man has experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, and witnessing his mother being abused, he's 4 times more likely to batter his spouse. If a woman who has experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, and has witnessed her mother being abused, she is 3.5 more times likely to be a victim of abuse. So you see, both of those folks come from the same cauldron, which is really important when you start trying to help them change their behavior. So the take home for this is that ACEs are really common, even in our most fortunate populations. The population that was studied in San Diego was 17,000, mostly white, college educated, people who had jobs and great health care. How many of you all fit into that demographic? Yeah, almost everybody, right? So the second really important piece was something I mentioned before, which is if you have one, you're very likely to have another. The more you have, the higher your risk of physical, mental, and social problems. And this is the big take home for all of us, no matter what we do in our lives, is that the ACEs affect quite a bit of our chronic health issues, our mental health issues, our social and behavioral issues as well, and economic issues. What I think is really interesting here is that I run into as a storyteller, as a journalist, is the hopelessness pie chart there. What I've learned is that when a child is growing up in these very difficult circumstances, children tend to think, because they are very self-oriented as they should be, that what's happening to them is their fault. So if you grow up and you've never been taught otherwise, and you never get out of that child's brain way of thinking that all this that happened to me was my fault, then you think you're bad. And if you think you're bad, what kind of hope do you have of change for the future? Not much, right? So what this knowledge, all of this knowledge, what Bessel has said, what the other people coming behind me are going to be telling you, is that this is really a biology of hope that we're talking about here. That with this knowledge, people can actually learn to help each other and to give that hope, which I think is pretty stunning. So 29 states and Washington, D.C. have done their own ACE surveys. It's pretty remarkable, and the results are pretty much the same, except for one part, and that is sexual abuse. It's not as high as in the ACE study. And I asked Dr. Felitti about that. He speculates that it's because when people did the ACE study, they had a piece of paper that or actually many pieces of paper that they took home, and they filled that out in their privacy of their own home, and they knew they were going to be giving this information to a trusted source, their physician or their nurse practitioner. These state surveys that are done by over the phone, and a stranger is calling you. So it's not likely that you're going to be disclosing that. So I wanted to get to the hope and the resilience piece of this. What's, of course, really important is that, especially for the therapists in the room, that you're helping people learn about what has happened to them and put it in perspective, and then give them some resilience practices and factors to start changing their life around. And what I'm really focused on is how do we work together to change our systems so that we prevent child abuse and we stop traumatizing already traumatized people. That knowledge is really important. Let me in my phone here because I had to write this down. I'm going to paraphrase Albert Einstein, who said that without changing our patterns of thought, we will not be able to solve the problems we created with our current pattern of thought. In other words, we are not going to be able to change our systems with the way that we were thinking when we set up those systems, right? So what we're doing now, and what the people I'm going to be telling you about are doing now, is they've changed their way of thinking completely. So this first one is Jim Sporletter. He was principal of Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, Washington, when he learned about the ACE study. And he said, I've been doing everything wrong when it comes to disciplining the students in my school. He was principal of a school, an alternative high school, where they put the throwaway kids, and every community has at least one, if not more. And those are the kids who have the highest ACE scores, the most troubles in their life. It was a small enough school so he was able to turn it on a dime, and all of his staff bought into this and said, yeah, we got to do this differently. And in 1 year, he had an 85% drop in suspensions and a 40% drop in expulsions. And mainly what he did differently was when a kid blasted out at a teacher, yelling obscenities because he'd been triggered, instead of the teacher blasting back and saying, go down and see the principal, the teacher would say, oh, wow, Sean, that's not like you. Are you okay? What happened to you? And the kids, what Jim was most surprised at, because he was really scared when he was trying this, but what really surprised him was that the kids just melted. Because they were getting ready to fight back at the person who was going to be yelling at them. When nobody yelled at them, they just melted and said, my dad's an alcoholic, and last night the police came, and he was taken off to jail, my mom's in the hospital, and I have to take care of my 2 little brothers, and I'm really scared.
Jane, there's no graceful way to do this.
Oh, okay. I'll just finish this one slide, and then this will be available so that you can look at it later. So after 4 years, 90% drop and expulsions down to 0. Their grades went up, their test scores went up, a number of kids going to college went up, truancy went down. These kids said that they also did their own ACE study, added their own questions. Their average ACE score, according to the CDC study, was 5.5. And they said that they felt safe in the first time in their lives at this high school.